Aí, assim, quando começar lá, aí vocês já podem começar. Eu vou até compartilhar aqui, tá?
Tá bom.
Ó, aí já está na tela, não sei se vocês conseguem ver aí. Eu compartilhei.
Sim,
Uhum.
consigo sim.
Então, aí, agora vocês já estão com o YouTube ligado aí de vocês, né? Já estão logados lá, né? Já estão na tela também?
Sim.
Tá. Então, assim que começar lá, aí vocês podem começar. Você já está no ar. Depois a gente edita essa parte aqui.
Tudo bem. So, Carol, I'm Carol Henkaps. I'm a professor, and we are starting the second session of the International Colloquium. And in this afternoon, we are having 3 speeches by professors. First, Professor Johanna Oksala, then Professor Leme, and then Professor Rafin. After that, we will have questions. It will be important for the audience to, I'd like to thank you. And as soon as Professor Johanna starts, you can access the link that will be available on the chat, so you can have access to the interpretation of the event. So I will be available after her speech. You can come back to this room so you can be with Professor Leme and Professor Oksala will hear the translation into Portuguese too. So thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to hear from you. I learn from you a lot. And let's start so we can take advantage of our time. Have a nice event. So we will introduce Professor Oksala. I will take my notes. Professor Johanna Oksala. She teaches philosophy in Chicago, and her publications include Foucault Freedom, Foucault Politics and Violence, and Feminist Experience. From this book, our research group translated one of the articles that has been launched in this book, New Feminism, Neoliberalisms and Counterconducts. And the other book was translated to Portuguese. You can start, Professor Oksala. Can you hear me, Professor Oksala? Renan? Muito obrigado pela apresentação, Carolina. Muito obrigado pelo convite. É ótimo estar aqui. Você conseguiu fazer essa tradução muito bem. Parece funcionar muito bem. Eu só fico um pouco confusa, mas acho que vocês todos conseguem me ouvir. Então, vou começar. O título é Os Sujeitos do Capitalismo, de Marx a Foucault. Talvez o princípio mais fundamental do marxismo seja a ideia de que o socialismo só pode partir da autoemancipação da classe trabalhadora. E existe um desacordo sobre como devemos começar esse trabalho, de que esteja necessariamente distribuído por classes, e a estrutura é determinada. As classes trabalhadoras são um grupo de pessoas que produz a mais-valia, em contraste com a classe capitalista, que possui os meios de produção e, portanto, é capaz de se apropriar da mão de obra excedente. Muitos teoristas marxistas dizem que essa definição objetiva é insuficiente para a noção da classe trabalhadora fazer sentido politicamente, não só economicamente. Ela deve incorporar uma dimensão subjetiva, a unidade da consciência de classe e cultura. A classe trabalhadora é formada no processo histórico de conflito e luta, conforme as pessoas experimentam e lidam com as situações individuais em termos de classes, como exploração. Até que ponto os aspectos subjetivos e objetivos de classe se relacionam se torna uma questão difícil. A consciência de classe não pode ser entendida como uma reação mecânica e determinista para as estruturas objetivas. É possível que os agentes sociais sobrevivam por vários conflitos e crises de capitalismo sem desenvolver uma consciência de classe explícita em resposta. Nenhum deles pode simplesmente colapsar os determinantes objetivos na consciência subjetiva e tratar todas as experiências vividas pelas classes subordinadas como experiências de classe e todas suas resistências como luta de classe. Se torna necessário investigar como as situações de classe objetivas ganham forma em agentes políticos e realidade social. Um número de pensadores marxistas reconheceu isso e desenvolveu relatos filosóficos importantes de subjetivação, baseado no trabalho de Marx. Na época de Foucault, essas respostas se dividiram em dois campos. Os relatos humanistas, que focam no problema da alienação, e os anti-humanistas, como Althusser, que constrói suas ideias de ideologia e interpelação. Meu papel é dividido em duas sessões, respectivamente, que se chama Crítica da Alienação e Crítica de Ideologia. Minha caracterização dessas posições marxistas aqui é breve e esquemática, porque a função é meramente fornecer um contexto para o meu argumento em relação à originalidade da resposta de Foucault. Minha contenção-chave é que Foucault rejeitou todas essas duas rotas teóricas e, portanto, desenvolveu um novo relato de subjetivação em resposta aos problemas que ele detectou. Entretanto, sua resposta deve ser reconhecida como uma reapropriação do pensamento de Marx, mesmo com diferenças significativas dos relatos de relatos marxistas dessa época. A primeira seção, alienação. A primeira forma possível de teorizar a constituição de formas capitalistas do sujeito, baseado no trabalho de Marx, é focar em suas ideias iniciais de trabalho como uma característica essencial do homem como uma espécie e o problema conectado de trabalho alienado no capitalismo. Essas ideias foram apresentadas nos manuscritos econômicos e filosóficos de Marx, de 1944, e foram apropriados por pensadores da escola de Frankfurt. A ideia-chave é a produção material, que a produção material é um reino central no qual os humanos se expressam e desenvolvem de formas livres e criativas, que são essencialmente o que eles são. Mas em sociedades capitalistas, os trabalhadores se tornam alienados porque o trabalho é forçado e é depleto de possibilidades de autorrealização. E o trabalhador, portanto, passa pelo trabalho como uma frustração de liberdade. E não é algo em que ele possa desenvolver livremente sua energia física e mental, e mortifica seu corpo e arruína sua mente. A crítica de alienação também pode ser lida como um relato de subjetivação capitalista. A formação do sujeito é cumprida por indivíduos alienantes das suas comunidades, a partir de alienar indivíduos de suas comunidades e sua existência material através do trabalho forçado. O reconhecimento da apropriação da mão de obra humana na produção de commodities capitalistas produz uma experiência de alienação mundana, e é um reconhecimento de que as produções econômicas, a economia produz o sujeito não simplesmente como um membro objetivo da classe, mas como subjetividade. Essa subjetividade política é produzida não só por condições econômicas, e é isso que restaura o sujeito em suas questões mais difíceis, autênticas. E isso deve ser lidado com cautela, devido às suas suposições do entendimento fortemente objetivista de uma boa vida e a concepção essencialista de si. Em das suas palestras, A Sociedade Punitiva, Foucault repudia a ideia de formas de trabalho como da natureza essencial e escreve: é falso dizer que famosos pós-hegelianos que o trabalho é a existência concreta do homem. O tempo e a vida de um homem não são o trabalho pela natureza. Eles são prazer, descontinuidade, festividade, descanso, necessidades, momentos, chances, violência e coisa e tal. Foucault argumenta que o capitalismo, de fato, produz a ideia de trabalho ao constituir o trabalhador que concretamente incorpora. Isso significa que o capitalismo torna o trabalhador em trabalho explorável através de disciplina e tecnologias de sujeição. As palestras da Sociedade Punitiva são uma instância clara de desenvolver essa ideia de formular uma genealogia de capitalismo. E o propósito desse poder disciplinar é a formação da força de trabalho. Um problema-chave no capitalismo industrial dos séculos 17 e 19 se tornam como consertar os trabalhadores para o aparato de produção, estabelecê-los em um lugar e movê-los conforme necessários, sujeitá-los ao ritmo, impor a eles a constância e regularidade, resumindo, formá-los como força de trabalho. Mesmo que o problema em sociedades feudais tenha sido tentar consertar o trabalhador a um lugar em qual o senhor exerce soberania e de qual ele possa extrair o trabalho, o objetivo das tecnologias de poder na sociedade capitalista é diferente. Os trabalhadores têm que permanecer móveis, mas o tempo de sua vida tem que ser sujeitado ao tempo de produção e lucro. E eles são capturados em uma rede temporal, não numa localização fixa. E embora rejeite, embora Marx embora Foucault rejeite essa ideia inicial de Marx, ele traz uma visão diferente de subjetivação no Capital. Na Rede do Poder, apresentada em 1976 no Brasil, Foucault, notadamente, apresenta talvez uma das suas ideias mais influentes, o conceito produtivo de poder, como algo aprendido de Marx. Ele menciona, novamente, a ideia de que o poder tem que ser analisado como tecnologias específicas ou práticas de poder, e observa que podemos encontrar os elementos fundamentais para tal análise em certos tratados políticos do passado. Ele, então, continua e dá 2 exemplos. Primeiro, o trabalho de Jeremy Bentham, que Foucault chama de o grande teórico do poder burguês, cujo modelo para a ideia prisão ideal, o panóptico, forneceu a ilustração central dos mecanismos de poder disciplinar em Vigiar e Punir. A segunda obra que ele seleciona é a Capital de Marx, em que diz que podemos encontrar elementos que eu vou usar pela análise de poder e seus mecanismos positivos. Foucault continua e esboça um número de proposições cruciais relativas ao poder que ele encontra no Capital. Ele menciona essas ideias bem brevemente na sua palestra, mas devem ser reconhecidas como centrais no seu projeto em evolução de um repensar radical do poder, e correspondem a propostas conhecidas de poder que aparecem na História da Sexualidade, publicada também no mesmo ano. Foucault começa dizendo que, para Marx, a sociedade capitalista não é unitária, e sim um arquipélago de diferentes formas de poder que interseccionam e mantêm sua especificidade. Marx põe bastante ênfase tanto no caráter específico e relativamente autônomo do chefe dentro de uma oficina, em relação ao tipo jurídico de poder que existe no resto da sociedade. O capitalismo não é só um modo de produção em cima de exploração e expropriação, mas também uma organização social específica que depende de relações distintas de poder. E Ellen Maxine Wood explica essa ideia. O capitalismo é uma organização social única porque a manutenção de propriedade privada e a extração de mais-valia é realizada sem que os proprietários cedam o poder político de uma forma convencional. Embora os poderes privados, políticos e econômicos estejam unidos nas mãos de um senhor feudal, dentro do capitalismo, são as leis autônomas de economia que exercem o poder econômico, não o capitalismo que exerce sua autoridade pessoal aos trabalhadores. E essas leis econômicas autônomas permitem que o capitalismo exerça um grau sem precedentes de controle, não só sobre a produção, mas sobre todos os aspectos da vida dos trabalhadores.
Outro ponto que Foucault fala de Marx é a forma local de poder, que nós temos em workshops, que você não tem a função simples de proibição. Tem a função essencial, eu vou citar, produzir a eficiência e dar habilidades ao produtor do produto. Como eu disse antes, acompanhando esse processo de subjetivização, foi o ponto central das séries do Foucault, da sociedade punitiva, e o Foucault formula no seu trabalho, que foi entregue no mesmo ano. Eu vou citar. Eu não acho que nós podemos simplesmente aceitar a análise marxista tradicional, que parece que o trabalho é a essência concreta do homem. O sistema capitalista é o que transforma o trabalho em lucro, em hiperlucro, e esse valor. Então, o capitalismo entra muito mais profundamente na nossa existência. Esse sistema, como foi estabelecido no século XIX, foi obrigatório para elaborar uma técnica política, técnica de poder, pela qual o homem ficou preso a algo como o trabalho. Encerro a citação. Então, de acordo com Foucault, o Marx já mostrou que a produção capitalista, seja cooperativa, de forma coletiva, ela pressupõe a sua possibilidade de condição, uma técnica de disciplina que confia e tem essa relação de poder, o qual é entendido de forma explícita politicamente. O poder disciplinatório só pode ser entendido em conexão com o desenvolvimento histórico do capitalismo, as necessidades específicas da força de trabalho, a vulnerabilidade e as limitações geográficas. O sujeito produz, o sujeito em si ele não é trabalhador por essência, ele se torna mais alienado de formas de trabalho. Ele deliberadamente produzem como se aqueles corpos não tivessem nada além de força de trabalho. Então, agora eu vou passar para a segunda parte da ideologia. Enquanto, na visão humanista de Marx, da subjetivização como um processo de alienação, o Foucault também parte desse anti-humanismo. A Tusser, a constituição do sujeito já formava um problema central. Ele reconhece que não era suficiente simplesmente entender como o capitalismo era capaz de reproduzir a força de trabalho para nutrir uma nova geração de trabalhadores com uma necessidade de habilidades específicas. Ele também reproduz a submissão às regras da ordem estabelecida. E ele diz que essa submissão foi atingida através desse aparato de status. A gente tem as instituições, como a religiosa, a educação, a família, a mídia, e assim por diante. Então, nós temos essa parte de repressão, como a polícia, como o poder militar. O ponto ideológico, ele não vem primariamente através de violência e repressão, mas através de ideologia. E ele também deixa claro que ele não está se posicionando a um simples entendimento da ideologia de acordo com a que consiste em mentiras inventadas pela elite, para o propósito explícito de fazer uma lavagem cerebral e controlar os trabalhadores. O que ele diz é que todos os indivíduos já vivem numa ideologia, e eu vou citar, que representa o relacionamento imaginário dos indivíduos com as suas condições reais de existência. Então, a ideologia não consiste em ideias espirituais, mas também materiais, no sentido em que estão formadas nisso e dentro das instituições específicas. Então, as instituições disciplinares, como escolas, hospitais, funcionam como um aparato de ideologia em que a ideologia são percebidas. E há essas representações, elas são descritas em ações, que são visíveis apenas na prática social e rituais. E também dizem que a ideologia constitui sujeitos para serem interpelados por rituais de reconhecimento ideológico. E eu vou citar: o que garante a nós que nós somos indivíduos concretos, distinguíveis e naturalmente insubstituíveis. Encerro a citação. quando o indivíduo toma parte desses rituais sociais, eles são sujeitos, eles se reconhecem e um aos outros nas descrições de entidades que são descritas. Agora, Foucault rejeita essa força atribuída à ideologia e a ideia de que os sujeitos são constituídos através do mecanismo dessa interpelação ideológica. Na verdade, ao poder, ele organiza diferentes questões sobre a ideologia, convencendo que isso trata problemas. Primeiro, a ideologia, eu vou citar, ela fica em oposição a algo que deve ser verdadeiro. Em outras palavras, ele diz que a ideologia, ela implica uma distinção entre ideologia e ciência. E ele diz, como muitos dizem, mantém um comprometimento forte com a parte científica do material histórico, e a gente tem essa distinção entre ciência e ideologia, que pressupõe algo que para ele a subjetivização era ligada aos efeitos das verdades científicas. O poder produz conhecimento, não ideologia, e permite e reforça o exercício de poder. Segundo, o Foucault critica o fato que o conceito de ideologia sempre se refere a algo que está em torno do sujeito. Ele fala que a sua abordagem com o que ele chama do marxismo acadêmico, que de acordo com ele, a gente tem a parte problemática das condições econômicas, políticas e sociais, que são impostas num sujeito já formado. Em contraste, Foucault quer mostrar como a prática social dá espaço a novos domínios de conhecimento, a novas técnicas, mas também dá olhos a algo novo para esses sujeitos. Termino a citação. Além disso, o autorreconhecimento era o mecanismo central. Para Foucault, não era necessariamente a subjetivização. Ele fala sobre a ideia que o poder, na sociedade burguesa capitalista, nega a realidade do corpo e só tem como alvo a consciência do sujeito. Ele diz que nada é mais corporal do que o exercício de poder no capitalismo. Apesar da aspiração materialista, o Marx pensa na consciência e na ideologia e subestima a importância do corpo nas relações de poder. O Foucault fala do poder disciplinatório, como nós conhecemos, por exemplo, como uma forma de poder que você guia o comportamento humano sem ter a consciência desse princípio. A disciplina é estabelecida de forma formal no nível do corpo através de hábitos. Incorpora para o corpo dos sujeitos ao se tornar incorporado na sua segunda natureza. Finalmente, Foucault rejeita a distinção proposta por Althusser pela base econômica. A gente tem as forças produtivas e as relações de produção e a estrutura das instituições legais e políticas ideológicas. Como nós vimos para Foucault, a constituição das formas capitalistas de subjetividade é um processo que está através das esferas políticas, sociais e econômicas. Uma vez que você começa a analisar as relações de poder na esfera econômica, por exemplo, quando nós vemos a distinção entre a parte econômica e política, nós descobrimos as relações de poderes que atravessam esses dois mundos. Então, Foucault começa com o problema que ele herda e também os pensadores de Marx na época, dizendo como a partir o sujeito do capitalismo é formado. Mas não satisfeito com a resposta de Althusser, ele começa a ir além. Nesse momento, nos anos 70, Foucault está pensando sobre os campos e categorias das perguntas de Marx. Ele também aceita o repúdio da ideia que o trabalho era a parte central da existência humana. De acordo com Foucault, essa parte essencial não é apenas um erro teórico, mas é perigoso. As lutas focadas no problema de alienação e normalizar visões daquele homem saudável do socialismo. Como alternativa, Foucault apresenta uma nova leitura de Marx, alguém que já reconhece a natureza difusa e heterogênea do poder, assim como o relacionamento que o poder tem com os sujeitos. Para concluir, nós devemos reconhecer o Foucault como um pós-marxista que foi modificado, rejuvenesce e estende as visões de Marx sobre poder e sobre subjetivização. Quando Marx é visto como um filósofo político, Foucault normalmente, nos seus trabalhos iniciais, e ele antecipa essa crítica dos direitos liberais e a liberdade com essa proteção e isolada dos sujeitos políticos. No entanto, se nós vermos isso pelas lentes de Foucault, como eu tentei fazer aqui, as críticas de Marx sobre o liberalismo foi um passo além do capitalismo. Esse sujeito livre político do liberalismo, na verdade, é o produto de uma relação específica de poder. A filosofia de Marx fornece um ponto essencial para ver as novidades filosóficas contra contribuições de Foucault e leva ele a construir uma abordagem filosófica e um aparato conceitual. Eu também quero sugerir que, mostrando que Marx e os pensamentos de Foucault convergiram nesse entendimento de poder e subjetivização, e tem consequências para as nossas críticas contemporâneas ao capitalismo. Deve dar uma pausa às avaliações que vêm em Foucault e Marx, e não algo tão oposto a essa análise crítica da nossa realidade política. Muito obrigada. Muito obrigada, professora Xala. Foi um prazer ouvi-la. Thank you very much, Professor Xala, for your presentation. You had a lot of questions here that you raised that are quite interesting to us. And then we're going to focus on the questions. So I ask for the audience to participate. You can send your questions, sometimes not necessarily as a question, but if someone would like to mention something that was interesting, maybe at the time we were not able to create a question, but we can ask for some support also in the chat. And we have Paloma. She is sending the links for this translation. When we have the questions, you can access again the translation session. So now we're going to talk to Professor José Luis Camralemi. I will introduce him. Professor, thank you very much for participating in this event, for being able to talk to us. We'll watch your presentation. So introduce him, Professor José Luis Camralemi. He's the auxiliary professor of the Department of Social Science in the University of Lisbon. And among some of his texts that are quite provocative, I loved the titles. I knew one of them, of How Many Through a Ship is Able. It's a title that reminds us of Foucault, and the other one, 50 Years of History of Craziness. So we have these titles of his work. So thank you very much. Now is your turn. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Carol, for your nice introduction. First of all, I'd like to thank you for inviting me. Margaret, Salma, and Marcio. I hope that I'm not forgetting anyone. The title of my speech that we have here, The Three Morals in Political Culture in the West. It's a generic title. It's related to the work that I've been doing. So during this time, we'll talk about this. And during this talk, I'll say talk because I'm not going to read the text. We are confined here. So we have been in lockdown here for a while. So sometimes it's tiring if I try to read something. So I will talk to you about what I'm going to do, about my topics. I hope what I will present here will be good for you so you don't waste your time. So what is the topic of my speech? It's the way that Foucault thought the right culture. That's a concept that was developed. That we have a book with this title, The Right Culture. Foucault approached this right culture, the authors that are more traditionalists, and the right culture, they have this rich concept that we have that we could use to think about this right thinking. Not just that, but the right representations and this culture. So how Foucault thought on the right, and then we need to consider 3 points. First of all, how this topic is in Foucault's work. Is there? I think it is. And second, how the studies that we have, the concepts, the methodology, the way of working of Foucault's are fundamental points for us to be able to think about this culture beyond what Foucault's thought. And finally, it's inevitable if we are going to think about the way that Foucault thought about the right, we need to answer the question, why Foucault was, since that time, he was criticized, and Simone de Beauvoir, he was considered a right author. So this is some critics that he received throughout his life. So ironically, this happened, but we have the Sartre criticism. So how we had in the 60s, how was these issues regarding the power that we have, the left party in France, the conservative party in France. So how we can have this in the politics, that we had the source of these domains. For example, Maurício Lazarato, he wrote a book that I've published. In a book that we have equality, and I was saying that French author had studied Foucault.
In this a new liberalist idea that starts in the 70s. In this context, even if that book had been published, if they had watched the classes, we obviously we should exempt Foucault from the responsibility in this aspect. But there is a propension to think in the analytical point, and review what Foucault mentioned about the critical morality. It's to use the arguments, even things you don't agree with. I have an example. And up to in 2002, François Devir and Bernard Cacut made an exception to Dallenbach, and they asked him to read something where Foucault presents his theories, and his answer was, I don't have anything to critique. It's rigorous, it's objective, and Foucault had objectiveness, honesty, and you could start studying Dallenbach by studying Foucault, because you won't find any errors. And how did Foucault, the way Foucault studied the right wing, it's not a novel theme. If you see publications after the Second World War, Simone de Beauvoir, and the book Furugese, and more recently, works that are just as important. The Reactionary by Jody Robin, and so on. The Rhetorics of Intransigence. And unfortunately, we found something. This is a caricature of this thought. And one of the biggest problems in the latest years is the way you explain one is not prepared for this right-wing culture that arose silently in a set of blogs and magazines, and it imposed a program, a right-wing culture program. And unfortunately, some left-wing thinkers didn't pay attention to it. And I would also say that Foucault and his defenders should have thought about it. So let's answer the first question. Foucault thought of right wing, yes, and precisely in a critical way. In his 3 courses, first about society and territory, and panoptics. And in these 3 courses, we find what defines the internal tension between right-wing thought and the liberal thought, and the neoliberal thought, and conservative thought. 2 courses are about this new liberal course, and the 3rd one is precisely, it's a genealogy of the right-wing thought in France. And we find concretely in the 66th class something about the French right wing. In this class, we can have another reading of the conservatism And it starts in France, not in England. When you mention the history of conservatism, it started in the book. Actually, what Foucault proposes is the political thought, the right-wing thought in France, and its genealogy starting in the 17th century, and with Louis for the 14th. And it starts with the right-wing thought in France. And it anticipates a set of ideas that we normally associate to Burke and other later thinkers. That is, we have a resource, an alternative, a French alternative that anticipates the themes of these three authors, Burke, Bagehot, and Werkschut. And I will talk about this later. I'd like to mention another point. One of the phenomena that were among the most interesting in the 20th century is the attraction of the left wing has to the same thinkers that are without doubt right wing: Michel, Heidegger, Hunger, and Carl Schmitt. Those are great thinkers, and they had a great influence on the right wing thought. And something that leaves left wingers helpless is this attraction, concretely by Foucault. In Brazil, we don't have this problem, but every thought today we have this these right-wing thinkers, and this sets a new challenge. And we have to think why these concepts are not indexed necessarily in the political agenda. A right-wing or left-wing agenda. It doesn't have to be indexed in a specific agenda. The same way, racism itself by Foucault shows there was a left-wing racism in the 19th century. And obviously, in the last class of the 66 class course, he shows the fascist ideas of the 66 coup. So you have to have an analogy to the genealogy. When we show that effectively the affiliation of the left wing will give rise to a point in opposition to the other two powers, the right and the family. We as a social group, a political group, if we are in opposition to this state, and a totalitarian state, there will be a reactivation of the functions that were originally created by this nobility. And when we read all this discourse, this humanist discourse in the left wing, we find the same notions that were initially formulated in the 17th and 19th centuries by the nobility. So if we have this genealogy of this conservative thought that says, as Book mentioned, we can't give a blank letter to this use, because there are traditions. We see that this must be respected. We see it through Foucault. This critique has an origin. It must be understood as mediocre. And it comes from nobility, and this class had its privileges. And this reactivation of history, the memory of these betrayals and expropriations, they were founded in two great principles: history of these struggles, and also denunciation of the betrayals, the thefts. And Foucault mentioned denounced this power, and it's not enough to remove the mask so that the power falls immediately. We see how the right-wing discourse feeds into the left-wing discourse, and we see the efficacy of this discourse and of these facts, which obviously puts people away. The right-wing culture.
So going back, the option of the right-wing culture, the extreme right culture. When we had the beginning of politics in this class, in the first class for that, Foucault starts mentioning some part of this author, Virgílio, that's mentioned in that other book. When I was thinking about this topic, about how this far right culture was considered, when we have this idea that sentence that he mentions, no one gets crazy because they want to. No one gets crazy because they want to. So It's not from the right-wing part of politics, the ones that want to be. So this sentence, it seems a little bit strange or stupid. So you get a comfort zone. And this idea we can find in the speech of Salazar, when we had that moment that the purpose of this movement was to restitute the classes, to provide some comfort to them. So this fascist movement was trying to replace the classes and to be sure about the things. So what is that? To not discuss, obviously, authority, family, the part of the work, and the government. So if you were part of this right wing, there's no cost. So you don't, it's not mandatory to have this logic. So in ecology, the logic is that we call a lot of them, but few are chosen. And some are selected by the right wing, but all the ones that vote in the right wing parties, the one that elect right wing governors, are they from this political side? Maybe if we define what we understand considering right wing culture, and we can find in Foucault this answer when he asks, what a person, for a person to consider to be something that belongs to a determined culture, and I was talking about the culture of the self. So they should be taken in a sense, in the logical sense, in the logical meaning of the word. We should think as, first of all, a set of values, and the values of the right wing, they are universal values, but they are not accessible for anyone. So what's accessible for anyone in the right wing culture? That's the question that we need to ask. And to achieve these values, we need to have some efforts and sacrifice. We need to ask, what is this cost? And finally, to have access to these values, we need to have techniques, and we need a set of knowledge. So without making fun of that, so we need to separate the dogs when we have sheep, and the person who takes care of the sheep. So it's not what this person think. What I want to say, I was part of a conference in a few time ago that was in the city of Florianopolis about this right-wing politics thinking, and I have approached this topic. So just to conclude, when we read different authors, York Peterson with the rules, we find not the excellence of a right thinking, in this Carl Schmitt level. We find a degraded thinking that's related to the work. At the same way that we have this degraded thinking, we have Olavo de Carvalho in Brazil doing the same. So we cannot mix the thinking that we have of these right-wing authors, and we should not mix this degraded speech that's provided to this herd, because we live in the representative democracy. We have a cultural war, and the worst thing that we can do is underestimate is to get this war in culture that we have through these authors. Of course, this culture war, we have them in the social media, but it's also in this plan that we have in this mediocre literature. So I will give you an example. In Portugal, the ultra-right party made a recommendation the last elections to the people that were part of this, that their target was the teachers. The target were the teachers. So their political target was the teachers. The ones that we need to convince are the teachers. So it's the hegemony that we have this new right wing, you know, regarding culture, about intellectual, about philosophy. So my work is based on this point of how Foucault thought on the right wing, about how they think and about their culture. So we had this first part, this first movement, and then we had the liberal movement in 78 and 79, where also is also mentioned in the final chapter of the Liberty Constitution, that we have this difference between a liberal right and a conservative right. So the concepts that Foucault presents are efficient to think about this point. And finally, we shouldn't underestimate, and doing this is not to criticize them. So about the right-wing thinking. So it's embarrassing when we have that critical points at the time. So because when we start criticizing, we lose the battle. Thank you very much, Professor Camaralemi. It's a shame that in Brazil, we cannot say that we don't have this denier speech and this cultural war. Unfortunately, it's also part of a reality. Olavo de Carvalho is there to talk about this, as you mentioned. And I was thinking how Foucault supports us, how his tools show to us that can be more complex than we think. When he think about the power, he says, how complex can it be? So thank you very much. So we are waiting for the questions. So now we have Professor Marcelo Raffin. I will introduce him, a formal introduction. So first of all, thank you very much, Professor Marcelo Raffin, for being part of this, to be here with us. It's a pleasure and an honor to listen to you. Professor Marcelo Raffin. He's the professor. So among his publications, we have one in French. We have other publications and some in Spanish, Through and Subjectivity of Michel Foucault, Political Ideas, Exposito and Negri, and Think Foucault High. It's urgent to consider Foucault nowadays. So thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank all of you for organizing this symposium, to be part of this event, especially Marcio and Margarete. I'm really happy to be able to talk with Professor Luis and with Professor Johanna. I will present a paper that the title is "To Get the Idea of Wishes in the Foucault's Politics as a Critical Resistance and the Liberty Practice." When we are considering politics, we had this person to create two images that oppose themselves. One is related to the paradigm about governance and biopolitics that Foucault develops after his analysis about the relationship between life and the power, the government, and the one that comes from the first as a reference, and when they criticize the government and as liberty and the exercise of power and something that the person can be the owner of his own existence. This last part of politics, he mentions this in the context that he say the subjectivation practice, the idea of wanting to do something and have a main role in that. The first element has been studied by the experts, not necessarily about the political ideas. The second one about wishes is not being analyzed. So in this paper, I propose to analyze the reaches of the idea of desire in Foucault's idea related to politics and also the resistance, the criticism, and the liberty practice. To do that, I will approach some of the developments of what we can say that we have these ideas of Foucault, the 18 articles and interviews about the popular riots that we had in 1978 and about removing the government, this revolutionary government in the beginning of 79 as a set of productions, especially the courses in the French College and some interviews where he brings the points about insurgency and resistance in the relationship that we have between life, government, and truth. When we consider the desire, it can reveal, among other things, a Foucault that we have some notion of niche, that when life can have different moments, that when we have the government that wants to shape our lives, and we have the becoming of the existence of the person. This formulation can present some theoretical problems and philosophical problems that doesn't remove the power for these ideas and what we can get from them. The goal of analyzing this desire, these wishes in this context is to try to get a set of tools that allows to approach and interact with the problems that we're going through nowadays. In our region, particularly in a moment that we want to have the logic for the neoliberal government, but where at the same time, life has a different meaning from its own desires, needs, and projects.
The first point is the role of will in the dossier Iran. And second is this idea of will that Foucault shows in this insurgencies and the insurgencies in Fiji and Haiti. And we have some brief conclusions in relationship to Foucaultian politics. So the first point, the issue of the will in dossier Iran. First of all, I'd like to to have it clear that those insurgencies in the Iranian revolution, it was a resistance to everything that meant to it the Pahlavi dynasty. Specifically, this movement assumed this resistance as a unifying movement. So we had Shiism, and this force Foucault identifies in these Iranian insurgencies. It was without weapons, unified and almost unanimous, rejecting the Shah's regime. And Foucault mentions that when and how politics and the political play will take place in traditional terms. Khomeini has a cohesion point in the revolutionary movement beyond the political traditions and negotiations. The following and the link that he develops is result of the fact that the Shah was not in Iran. In the core of these analyses, Foucault shows clearly the power relations as strategical, and he shows the insurgents as a will, and mentions that through the insurgents, he makes this power exercise concrete, and the political plays its game. Foucault also warns that at some point, the revolutionary experience paves the way to several possibilities, among which there are authoritarian solutions. And Foucault identifies religion as a political factor. In this sense, he finds the expression of his sense of counter-conduct that he had presented in his course as a counter-conduct. He means a resistance in the context of movements, aiming the direction of the determination of an imposed conduct by the government. The religious analysis as a political factor also it shows the will of Islamic movement and shows religious dimension in the political life as the politics as the receiver of this religion. And Foucault doesn't go much deeper into religiosity, apart from some interviews in the L'Observateur in January. In this January interview, political spirituality is shown above all as an experience in the sense of battalion sense of becoming different from itself. You should risk to stop being yourself. In the Iranian case, in the Islamic religion, the concrete answer that can be organized in a political movement in which the Iranians showed the will of spirituality. And this factor, both political and religious, is retrieved by Foucault in this interview of imagining a different possible world in which reality is not definitely established, but it's immersed in our time, and there may be an openness, point of light that allows us to access a better world. This idea, according to Foucault, was inspired by the reading of this Principles and Hope by Ernst Bloch, and it's religion and scatology. And Foucault understands the will as something that fixes the subject to his own location, the pure side of the subject. The will as the activity of the subject. So both senses, will and subject, are reciprocal. In these considerations, Foucault recognizes a Fichtean root without specifying the notions that there are from the philosopher Anamon. And I will also mention the Haitian insurgents in the 70s. I would also like to mention that Hume and Ushimoto in April 1968, Foucault proposes that the Western philosophy lacks this principle. In these analyzed coordinates, Foucault showed what these movements meant as self-identification, the exercise of a power imposing itself on another power, and a possibility of reverting a state of domination. And we also have to highlight that the possibility of resisting the local government and starts getting starker contours in the late 60s, because among other aspects, you have territorial insecurity and its importance in acts of resistance, since the end of the Middle Age. And Foucault affirms that this understanding of counterconduct allows us to analyze the components in the broader field of politics and power relations. These ideas will be retrieved by Foucault and during conferences in 1979, when he affirms there's no power without rejection or revolt. And this aspect of resistance that also subjects itself, by the way, was mentioned by Foucault when he mentioned where there's power, there's resistance. And therefore, resistance is never in a position of exteriority to the power. The same idea appears in the defense of society. Along the same lines, we can affirm this exercise of the exercising this power of this subjectivation of about freedom is based on the exercise of critique as a diagnosis of each singularity and its position in relationship to others and the world. During the conference, Foucault, before the French Society of Philosophy, he mentioned this critical attitude is the art of not being government this way. As a general cultural form of questioning the arts of the current government and how the involuntary servitude shows itself. In turn, Foucault has liberty as an assumption of life and not as a permission granted by the government. And this Foucauldian idea of freedom that it relies on relationships of power. So he proposes the notion of practices of liberty as resistance to the powers in the relations I live and that I keep with myself, and it allows me to be the subject of my own existence. For Foucault, it's necessary to exercise freedom and also to exercise power and affirm a life. Therefore, to understand these events, Foucault interprets in Iran implies the need to reinsert them in a way we can understand this relationship between the production of subjectivity and subjectivation that includes these processes and lives that were submitted by determined relationships that allows for a new subjectivation from the affirmation of life as an exercise of resistance to critique and liberty. So this subjectivity can become the subject of its own existence on base of its life. So the poietic aspect is based on the determination of life. So that makes total sense.
And a collective work among others to produce another life and another world, facing the differences that we have regarding existence. The second point, Foucault is aware of Nietzsche and the resources. As we know, Nietzsche, for sure, one of the strongest person that is related to Foucauldian thinking. So they have the Nietzsche as a background that's used as a political reference and the developments in the 70s. Since the beginning, the first courses in the College of France, and we have the genealogy since the first model of sexuality history and the papers regarding Iran. So about this relationship between Foucault and Nietzsche, that we have this new thinking and new beginnings, the desire of power has a decisive role in elaborating this desire in Foucault. But the development of this desire, when we have this niche knowledge, we cannot separate this from the elaboration that he has about the knowledge of life in this biopolitical paradigm, also with these roots in niche. So as we have this concept and the other, we have this thinking. So they have some interests and researches in Foucault. Nietzsche has this desire of power to the self-affirmation of life when they have this contingency and perspective. And when we have life in this contingency of existing, we go back to the same. We have saying yes to the life cycle, and also the repetition also related to this formulation. As we have an explanation, the basic idea of the desire of power, we have Nietzsche in the second part as so spoke Zarathustra. So we have this, when you can be better than you, we have the developments, and we have these other parts about the human being. So Nietzsche mentions that every place that he found human beings, he says, I have found desire of power. And only there's life, there's also this desire for power. So Nietzsche combines life and desire, and of course, power. After that, Nietzsche mentioned these ideas about life as the desire of power when he says that life is completely a desire of power. And perspective, a tragic perspective, he mentions that some reactive forces, they coexist in this power desire that take to keep and the access to when we have the surplus of this. To him, there's a tension between the life that exceeds itself and the one that we have because of the strengths that we have that we need to keep as shapes of life. This desire of power, where we have this exercise that is to show the power, is to create. So this activity is fundamentally in artistic type or poetical type. In my opinion, these ideas are actually at stake when we have Foucault's elaboration, when we have the works in the 70s regarding politics. We cannot forget the potentials of the Nietzsche proposal about this desire of power that is a strength to create as a fundamental capability of existing, to provide shape, to be creative, to be imaginative. But on the other hand, as I have mentioned, we cannot forget that in the interview that we had, Foucault says that when we have this idea of desire, that we have this context, we are considering this way of life. Unfortunately, Foucault doesn't develop the components that he gets from the German philosopher to have this idea of desire related to resistance and also the spirituality. So what would be these connections that Foucault established with this way of thinking? What elements he could get from him to have this idea of desire when he's considering him in his interview? An attempt of trying to answer these questions, we need to work in a way that we can only make assumptions. And we have some hypotheses to propose that maybe we have some risks regarding theory based on the different structures and the reach of this thinking of both philosophers. Even though, and taking into consideration the complexity of this philosophy, we have some different thinkings that Fichte mentioned throughout his work. I will say that it's likely that when Foucault mentioned Fichte to refer to the idea of desire that's at stake in his analysis, when we had the riots in Iran in the 78, maybe he's mentioning some developments, some fundamental developments that Fichte presents in his idea of science. Particularly, I think that Foucault is considering the idea of Fichte calls the pure, where we have some establishment of without any other point. So this pure being is considered as an activity that we can always have. So we have the productions as becoming and some other points. This activity that we have of the being, it takes an action, original action, that's specified as to put yourself, that is at the same time we go against this other person that's also you. So the person that you are and the person that you're not. So he explained as the two first moments of life. So when you have this absolute and the universal, and we have the individual, and we have this person, the human being, that is creative, spontaneous, and we produce something that's determined. And also this counterposition of the person that you not consider yourself, that you can quantify, that you can be limited as an individual being, and you can act as a third element, the third point of the subject's life. So when we have this philosophy, we can see a concept of the person, of the being, that through this person you can accomplish what you want, becoming everything that you can be. So for this reason, we can conclude that this being is for Fichte, the action. So if you are, you can be accomplished. So it's a dynamic that we don't consider anything outside the person. So that's why he's the philosopher of this, of how human being can be spontaneous and also can be free. So in particularly, if we take into consideration the third point of the moment of the life of this person, as we have this subjectivity, maybe Foucault is thinking about the different possibilities of this person, of this human being, this subject, that's determined in a specific limitation of its own particularities and its own existency. Also in the limitation of its own freedom. But certainly we need to recognize the surprise and how we can consider that strange, this philosophy, to understand the idea of desire. For this case in Iran, we have differences between Fichte and Foucault in general terms. We have this, their thinking, so that are different. So we have Platon and others, and we have some resources and the refusal of that. So it's a particularity when we consider the way they think about that moment, and we have some singularities. Even though I think that we need to mention that when we have this logic in the life of the spirit, fifth, considering the person spontaneous creativity as original source of production that we are not aware of. And he doesn't identify this subject with the awareness, with the consciousness, but it is considered through thinking when you think about the product and the activity trying to make this content possible. In Foucault's case, we have a singularity, that we have some resistance, and we have power, and we have criticism, and we have freedom to put into practice. But the resources to consider the desire as something that you have your own position for a subject, a pure act of the subject, it was mentioned by himself. So there's no choice besides trying to know about this relationship. Being developed the previous ideas, we can have some conclusions related to the idea of Foucauldian politics and the freedom practice. Number one, the idea of desire as a pure act of the subject, it presents as a key point to have your notion of politics in a way that it allows to have a power exercise to the self-affirmation of life. And so the desire, the movement that we have, singularity, to have at the same time inside the story and away from this story as a point of light and attraction that allow us to access a better world. Number two, versus the idea of nature, of the desire to be able to have some developments. As Foucault's mentioned, it allows to understand better what we understand as a desire in the context of the political analysis as an individual desire. Number three, and the ideas about this, the desire comes in Foucault's thinking as a way to get our lives the strategies of some powers and to exercise other powers that allows our singularity to listen to other people. So we need to have imagination, we have different productions and a collective work among others to have different lives and different world, because we have the contingency of existence. Thank you very much.
Number three, as a coronary, you have a coronary, you have the capacity of subtract from our lives the strategies of some powers that allows us that our singularity becomes others. And this work requires imagination, varidictions, and a collective project to produce other life and other worlds in the contingencies of existence. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Marcelo Raffin. I'm moved by your talk. This text has a vocabulary to think.
So we can,
as an exercise of life, and women and the indigenous population and Black people who have experiences to this vocabulary is very powerful for us Thank you very much. Just to advise everybody, thank you, everybody. We will read the questions. I will start by reading 2 questions for each participant. So I will ask you some summarization because of time restrictions. So first, Professor Oxala, and then Professor Leme, and then Professor Raffin. So Paloma and Fabio supported us with these questions. Some comments. So Professor Alfredo Veganelli mentioned that Oxala was very clear and precise. Cado Ribeiro saluted Oxala and Raffin and Leme, and Professor Cesar Gangotto sent a hug to Marcelo Raffin and Leme, and Aldo Ambrosio comments about Leme's speech. It's interesting, the line of reasoning and about the fascination the right wing exercises on the left wing. So Professor Oxala, I will read the
Se Foucault deveria ser ensinado nas escolas para ser mais fácil para criticar o capitalismo, isso seria mais fácil para os alunos. Sim, ótimo. Eu acho que eu não consigo adivinhar, então eu vou responder aqui. Então, eu acho que ensinar o Foucault, eu acho que é importante. O que funcionou para mim quando eu era aluna, quando eu li Foucault, foi o fato que ele fornece uma caixa de ferramentas que você pode aplicar em diferentes pontos, diferentes questões. Mas há várias outras questões, como muitos de vocês sabem, vocês trabalharam com essas questões, ele pode nos ajudar a pensar sobre vários pontos contemporâneos. Claro, sexualidade, gênero, diferentes pontos, esses são os mais óbvios, mas eu acho que também há outros problemas na nossa ordem social e econômica, particularmente nas formas neoliberais de capitalismo. Sim, eu acho que Desculpa, eu estou brincando. Eu acho que, claro, não é que eu acho que o Foucault consiga explicar tudo, claro que ele não pode explicar os problemas. Então, eu acho que a parte marxista é importante, mas o que eu estava tentando compartilhar nessa parte específica, então, as perguntas tradicionais marxistas com a formação de classe, nós precisamos uma análise Foucaultiana nessa formação. E eu acho que o paralelo, a questão em paralelo, é que nós podemos ver essa teoria. A teoria feminista marxista, ela estava lutando para entender e para explicar as relações de poder que tiveram a subjetividade das mulheres, que as relações não são reduzidas a relações econômicas. E eu acho que se nós pensarmos no desenvolvimento em teorias de gênero, nos anos 90, a importância do trabalho de Foucault e assim por diante, através da Judith Butler, eu acho que está claro na teoria feminista que com todo esse entendimento após os relacionamentos entre poder e identidade ou subjetividade, foi bem difícil ter estratégias de resistência ou entender essa pressão. Então, eu acho que Foucault foi muito importante para a teoria feminista, mas eu estou tentando dizer aqui que mesmo, claro, algumas pessoas vão dizer que tudo bem, classes não são uma categoria relevante mais, é por isso que nós somos todos Foucaultianos, mas nesse trabalho, mesmo a tentativa de engajar com a pergunta marxista da formação de classes, o que é ser uma classe trabalhadora, ser um sujeito político da perspectiva de Foucault, é bem útil e importante. Obrigada, professora Oxala. So now I will read the question for Professor Câmara Leme. So it's quite interesting. So if you think how we underestimate the speeches and the characters of the right wing and the conservatory parties, so how to think the scenario in Brazil as we have these people are quite arrogant on the left wing side when they have the speech and the character that's being the government, the president of the country. Do we have two questions or is it one question? I don't know if reading the summary that I have sent. In the summary, I have a point that's about the people that vote. So I mentioned that right after the Second War, when we have Albania, this journalist went there and she wrote an article. And she was asking how was possible for that population in the last days of wars. They have the Nazi regime there, so a few years later became democratic. So in Europe, we have this problem when we have the people voting the Communist Party in France, and they changed the vote. In Portugal, it happened the last elections. The people voted we had some people voting the Communist Party, and they changed their votes to the right-wing party. So in Brazil, when we have the second term of President Lula, he had a rate of approval of 85%. So that's not the same of voting for his party. This approval rate means that the people that voted in Bolsonaro, 55 million, they approved Lula at the time. And the point is that Foucault's mention is that to realize how the people changed their votes. When Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, they attacked Foucault in the 70s, when he published his paper, it was related that Foucault was showing that was the same idea to explain the same way as Marx. So when I mention this, we have some criticism about a class that I show, part of this far left, and we have this neoliberal regime in France in the end of the 70s. It was exactly the same ideas, the same concepts that the Conservative Party was talking about the other parties. So when we have this, he was trying to show these different speeches and the way that they obey to the same things. They are obeying to the same grammar, let's say. So if we don't study this grammar, we are not going to realize the problems that we have in the heart. So we have this idea of the far right or the moderate right, this conservative right, neoliberal one, or even ultra right parties. So we have this communication of the people voting, and we have these people doing the same things.
And people who voted for Lula and after Bolsonaro maybe are people who can vote for Lula this time. It's something that led to another. It's not in the agenda. No, it's obvious that one is better than the other. It's there's no discussion about that. But it's I think it's a matter of thinking of the voter base. So when we see the discourses, there's part of the left wing that gets very irritated because we have our uncertainties confronted. We don't discuss revolution, we don't discuss Cuba, and don't discuss Gulag. So we can find this comfort zone in the left. I don't know if I answered the question. Yes, there's no doubt about it. And it also gives us hope. And we hope it becomes true. So we can vote with conscience in 2022. I will ask questions to Professor Raffin. Just a minute. First, the notion of general will. Is it a classical concept? What is the theoretical displacement by Foucault in relation to this concept? This is the first question. And the second question, to what extent can we think of an approximation or distance by Foucault in spite of the dialectical critique? Can there be a dialogue? Thank you for the questions. The first question was made by Maurício Pellegrini. I would say that this theoretical displacement by Foucault was important in relation to the classical concept of political philosophy in the West about the will. Foucault rejects a transcendentalist perspective about the will. Therefore, I tried to find some elements. There was an indication by Foucault in his interview with Sassini, but there are hypotheses to be worked on. I think we have to have a selection of elements from Fichte, because the perspective of the Fichtean philosophy is totally transcendentalist. It's about the pure I, and what we can find in this philosophy also is a backdrop of creation that maybe can place this thought next to other perspectives. Therefore, I highlighted Fichte doesn't identify the I, the self, the third element of the self, as conscience, but he mentions it, of course, and that's what I would mention. Perfect. It's the second question, sorry, was made by Alec. Thank you. Also, in relationship to Hegel, two things I'd say. First, Foucault rejects the idea of will as it is explained and conceived by Hegel. In the same interview to Sassini, he says his notion is disagrees. Fichte, it's Fichte, but he doesn't explain further. That's why I find it surprising to have this explanation by Foucault. So I tried to do some research about this point, because I think Foucault wants to say something with that. Secondly, as you know, Foucault made a philosophical thesis about Hegel. Maybe we can find some elements there to have another work. It's something we have to do. It's not obvious. First thing is Hegel rejects the perspective, the Hegelian perspective of the duality between the individual and the collective. But maybe if we analyze the thesis and other texts, we can find some elements in the Hegelian philosophy to establish some link with this notion of will. I think that's about everything. Those are the transcendentalist perspectives. Thank you very much, Professor Raffin, Professor Lem, Professor Axala, Sara. Obrigado pelo tempo, pela paciência. Obrigado. Salma, would you like to say anything else? No, I've just joined because it's in the end, but I've been watching it all the time. Just 2 reminders before I forget, because I have them written down here. First, N-1, the publisher, is offering a discount in its books, so lots of authors who have been debating with us have books published by them. They are giving discounts by the publisher. This is the first reminder. Second one is tomorrow. We will have the 3rd round at 9 a.m. Everybody is invited, and we will hear Professor Tony Hara, Professor Julio Groppa, and Selmo Haroldo de Rezende. Everybody is invited tomorrow at 9. And we say farewell, Salma. No. I would just like to thank you and say that We are very grateful. And I've watched you, and now I'm here. So you hosted this moderation very well. Thank you very much. Thank you for the technical team, the interpreters, sign language and English and French. And thanks to the audience. Thank you, and see you tomorrow.